Crystal chandeliers glistened across the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, where New York's most lavish charity gala of the year was in full swing. Guests wore dresses worth more than most apartments, their laughter soft and expensive, glasses clinking to the rhythm of a live jazz quartet. Everything shimmered with perfection, except for one person. Rachel Moore adjusted the tray of canapés in her hands, holding her breath as she passed a group of VIPs chatting about their recent seaside retirement explorations. Her black dress, though carefully steamed, sagged slightly at the shoulders. No surprise, it was borrowed from her best friend. "Just don't spill anything," she whispered to herself, as if the phrase could cast a spell strong enough to cancel her lifelong streak of clumsiness. At 26, Rachel was a marketing graduate from a small Brooklyn college, once hopeful about starting her own ad agency. But life had its way. These days she worked morning shifts as a barista and nights freelancing as an event assistant. For the past 3 years, every penny she earned went to supporting her mother's heart treatment, a strong woman battling a quiet illness. Tonight's gala was the fanciest event she'd ever worked, the kind where ball gowns cost more than her car. Every step she took felt like balancing on glass. Then came the voice, deep, calm, in control. "If I'm not married by my 33rd birthday, the board will hand everything to Lucas." Rachel froze. Her eyes flicked towards table 12. The man speaking had neatly styled dark brown hair and a timepiece glinting under the light. She knew that face. Ethan Carter, interim CEO of Carter Holdings, real estate mogul. The same man Time magazine once called New York's most eligible bachelor. At that exact moment, a tiny white dog darted across the floor like a rocket. "Charlie, come back here!" a woman in a red gown shouted. The dog slipped right through Rachel's legs. She gasped, tripping on the hem of her dress. There was no time to catch herself. The tray flew into the air like a slow-motion scene from a disaster movie. Rachel toppled forward, straight toward the man at the table, straight toward Ethan Carter. Rachel shut her eyes, bracing for impact on the cold marble floor. But instead of the hard crash she expected, she landed in something warm and solid. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her, and a faint scent of expensive cologne surrounded her. "You all right?" a deep voice asked, right next to her ear. She opened her eyes. Ethan Carter's face was inches from hers. His pale gray eyes stared at her in surprise, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of amusement. Her cheeks burned instantly. I'm sorry, I didn't see the dog. I tripped over my dress. I wasn't trying to throw myself at you," she blurted, scrambling to get back on her feet. "No harm done," Ethan said, still holding her arm gently, as if afraid she might fall again. "Are you okay?" "Just embarrassed," she muttered, realizing half the ballroom was staring. From the far end, a young woman rushed over, scooping up the tiny dog who wagged his tail like he'd just won a medal. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. He slipped out of his leash. Are you okay?" the woman asked breathlessly. "I'm fine," Rachel replied with a tight smile. "I guess he just had a mission to cause chaos." Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "Well, now I can officially say a beautiful woman fell into my arms at a high society gala." Rachel's mouth dropped open. "I don't think that's exactly something to brag about." "I find it rather delightful," he chuckled. "What's your name?" Rachel Moore," she said, swallowing hard. "I'm just event staff, not a guest." "Rachel Moore," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "That's a very honest-sounding name." Before she could reply, a woman in black, clearly the event coordinator, rushed over, pale as a ghost. "Rachel, are you all right?" "Oh my goodness. Mr. Carter, are you hurt?" "I'm fine, really," Ethan answered calmly. "She's new. I'm so sorry for the incident. I'll send her to the back immediately." "No need," Ethan interrupted. "Everything's fine. Actually, I'd like to speak with her after the event. About a job." Rachel blinked. A job? He had to be joking, or planning to sue her for emotional distress. This sort of thing only happened in movies. "Of course, sir," the woman replied, clearly flustered. Rachel stood there, stunned. Ethan Carter, young, powerful, ridiculously good-looking, wanted to speak to her after the most humiliating moment of her life? The universe had to be playing a very weird game. Rachel couldn't stop replaying the moment she'd fallen into Ethan Carter's arms. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his pale gray gaze, felt his hand steadying her, remembered the quiet way he smiled when she apologized. The whole scene from the night before felt like a strange, slow-motion dream, awkward, absurd, and somehow not terrible. So when her phone buzzed the next morning and a composed voice introduced herself as Ethan Carter's executive assistant, Rachel was in no way prepared for what came next. He wanted to see her in his private office. At 10 a.m., she hung up in shock, hands trembling around her coffee cup. The world tilted slightly off its axis. She told her mother everything, every ridiculous, unbelievable detail. And even as she said the words aloud, Rachel still couldn't fully process them. But standing in front of the Carter Holdings building, its glass facade towering above Park Avenue, she could no longer pretend this was a hallucination. She had, in fact, been summoned by one of the most powerful men in New York City, after quite literally crashing into him. The receptionist directed her to the 32nd floor. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into a space that felt more like an art gallery than an office. Dark hardwood, minimalist furniture, and glass walls overlooking Central Park. Ethan stood by the window, effortlessly composed. He turned as she entered, greeting her with a calm nod. "Thanks for coming." Rachel sat across from him, unsure what to expect. "I still don't really understand why I'm here." He got straight to the point. There was an old bylaw, his grandfather's legacy, that required the CEO of Carter Holdings to be married. Ethan, currently interim, had 3 months before his 33rd birthday. If he failed to marry by then, control would go to Lucas, his cousin. His tone remained calm, businesslike. But what followed next nearly made her drop her bag. "I want you to be my wife. For 6 months. A contract." Her heart skipped a beat. He explained further. Legal paperwork, defined terms, no emotions involved. In exchange, she would receive $50,000 per month and a $200,000 bonus at the end. She barely whispered, "Why me?" His answer was quiet. "Because you're not like anyone else in my world, and I believe you have no hidden agenda." Rachel didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted to walk away, but part of her couldn't stop thinking about the number. It was more than she'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to pay off her mother's medical debt, enough to start fresh, maybe even that tiny ad agency she once dreamed of in college. That evening, she told her mother everything. Evelyn listened without interrupting. Only when Rachel finished did she speak. "You've spent your whole life putting others first," she said. "If this is a chance to choose something for yourself, maybe it's worth considering." Rachel hesitated. "But doesn't it sound crazy to you?" "It does, but sometimes the right kind of crazy can change everything." That night, Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words "contract marriage" echoing in her mind like a silent drumbeat. By morning, she would have to make a choice, return to her struggling reality, or sign a deal that might just rewrite everything she thought she knew about herself. Rachel had always believed that life-altering decisions would arrive with certainty, when heart and mind aligned perfectly. But that morning, as she stepped out of her small apartment in Queens, contract in hand and gray Manhattan skies above her, she realized, sometimes all it takes is one reckless moment, and she had just stepped into it. The next morning, Rachel stood at the door of Carter Holdings, gripping a thick contract she'd read 3 times the night before. Her heart pounded, not entirely from fear, but from disbelief. She was really going through with this. Ethan waited inside a smaller boardroom, alongside his attorney and assistant. The atmosphere was formal, polished, like any major business deal. And in truth, that's exactly what it was, at least for Rachel. "We included the clause you requested," Ethan said, voice steady. "If I breach any part of the agreement, it's voided, and you still receive full payment." Rachel nodded. She picked up the pen. One signature, and her life turned a corner she never thought she'd see. What followed was a crash course in becoming someone's wife, at least in appearance. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry when she had to learn how to sit with perfect posture, smile just enough, and answer questions like, "When did you first meet?" "We just need consistency in the details," Julia, Ethan's assistant, explained. "People will ask, a lot." Ethan, though the mastermind behind this, often looked more tense than Rachel. He repeated their fake love story so many times that he started sounding like he was reciting legal terms. "Where did you two meet?" Julia asked during their first mock Q&A. "At the charity gala," Rachel replied. "She fell into me," Ethan added, a faint smile on his lips. It was a brief moment, but Rachel noticed the softness in his eyes. They posed for engagement photos at an upscale studio. Rachel wore a silk cream dress, hair curled into soft waves, lips a subtle red. Ethan stood beside her, hand resting gently on her back like he'd done it 1,000 times. "Lean in a bit, a little closer," the photographer coached. Rachel turned her head and caught Ethan's gaze, long enough for her heart to skip. Later in the car, they sat in silence. "You did well," he said, eyes still on the city outside. "Not bad for an event assistant," she replied, half joking. He smiled. For the first time, it didn't feel like the polished grin of a billionaire. It felt real. The contract was signed, the terms laid out, but Rachel quickly realized that becoming Ethan Carter's wife on paper wasn't just about a signature. It was a role she had to fully step into, and that role began with a wedding dress. The bridal boutique sat on the 3rd floor of a vintage building in Soho, sunlight pouring through oversized windows, catching the soft shimmer of dozens of wedding gowns lined like quiet promises. Each one looked like it belonged in a dream. Rachel never imagined herself in a place like this, much less trying on a wedding dress for a marriage she knew wasn't real. But as she stood before the mirror, wrapped in a silk gown that hugged her shape, her hair swept up in veil cascading down her back, something inside her stilled, not because of how she looked, but because of how Ethan was looking at her. He sat quietly on a velvet chair across the room, saying nothing at first, just watching, a little longer than necessary. Then, in a low voice, he finally said, "It suits you." Rachel gave a soft laugh, turning toward the mirror. "You were going to say I look beautiful, then changed your mind, weren't you?" Ethan shrugged. Trying to be a good fake husband, no exaggeration. But his eyes betrayed more than his words. The following days became a blur of lessons and etiquette, a crash course on how to belong in a world Rachel had only seen on the glossy pages of second-hand fashion magazines. Julia, ever efficient and slightly intimidating, taught her how to hold a wine glass properly, how to smile with restraint, and how to comment on abstract art without understanding it. "Speak less, observe more," Julia advised, "and never look shocked when someone shows up with a purse worth a sports car." Rachel tried to memorize it all, though sometimes she felt like a character in a high society drama rather than a real person preparing for marriage. Ethan began showing up more frequently to help rehearse. Together, they sampled French hors d'oeuvres, practiced slow waltzes, and recited their fabricated love story so many times that even Rachel began to believe it. "I remember you wore a midnight blue tux that night," she said during one session. "And you spilled a tray of tarts on my tie," Ethan replied, smirking. "A sign from fate, don't you think?" He looked at her, silent, but his eyes said more than a quip ever could. Though everything began with a contract, Rachel couldn't ignore the shift between them. Somewhere between etiquette lessons, designer fittings, and shared glances, something was changing. Not in Ethan. In her. She found herself waiting for his arrival, feeling a strange safety in his presence. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it was happening, and Rachel wasn't sure how to stop it. The wedding arrived faster than Rachel had expected. Even though everything had been rehearsed and planned down to the last detail, she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling as she stepped out of the vintage Rolls-Royce and faced the floral gates of the estate where the ceremony would be held. The early May air was crisp and gentle, but inside her, everything felt unsettled. Dressed in a custom-designed white gown, Rachel was acutely aware that she had become the center of an event watched closely by the elite, not for love, but out of curiosity. Dozens of eyes followed her every step, figures from finance, media, and society. They weren't there for her. They were there to see who this woman was, who had managed to tie down Ethan Carter, the famously cold face of New York's financial world, with something as binding as marriage. Ethan stood at the end of the aisle. Impeccable in a tailored black tuxedo, he looked composed enough to make the entire scene feel like a perfectly directed film. When their eyes met, he gave a slight nod, not as a groom awaiting his bride, but as a partner confirming that their arrangement was going exactly to plan. The vows were read, the rings exchanged. Everything unfolded like a seamless performance. But when Ethan leaned in to kiss her before the eyes of hundreds, Rachel was caught off guard, not by the act, but by the gentleness in the way he touched her. Soft, unforced. As if, for that one fleeting second, he forgot this was all part of a contract. The reception that followed was a display of grandeur. Reporters pressed in, cameras flashed relentlessly. Congratulations and questions came in waves. Rachel smiled when she should, answered politely, and stood exactly where she was told, just as she'd practiced. But inside, she felt like a stranger in her own wedding. "How does it feel to become Mrs. Carter?" a journalist asked, clearly intrigued. Rachel hesitated. So many answers formed in her mind, all true, but none she could actually say. Eventually, she gave a soft response. "I suppose I'm still learning to get used to it." It wasn't a lie. She was learning how to live a life that didn't quite belong to her. They left the venue under a flurry of flashes and endless congratulations. In the car, silence stretched between them. Ethan stared out the window. Rachel leaned her head against the glass, trying to breathe steadily. Everything that had happened, the dress, the kiss, the well-wishes, had been for show. Yet she felt drained more than she'd expected. The final stop of the day was the penthouse prepared in advance. Everything had been arranged, champagne, white roses, candlelight, as if they were truly a newlywed couple beginning a honeymoon. Ethan opened the bedroom door, placed the luggage in the corner, then turned to her. He didn't speak right away, but his eyes said enough. He, too, felt the surreal weight of it all. "I'll take the guest room," he said quietly. "If you need anything, just call." She nodded. There was nothing else to say. The next morning, their wedding photos were everywhere, on websites, in newspapers, across morning talk shows. The coldest CEO on Wall Street gets married. The mystery of Rachel Moore. From event assistant to millionaire wife. Rachel sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through headlines without truly reading them. Those images didn't feel like her, at least not the version of herself she used to know. Ethan entered with 2 cups of coffee, placing one in front of her without a word. The silence between them now felt less awkward and somehow more familiar. "We did well," he said after a moment. Rachel nodded. "The media seems satisfied." "So the contract is working," he replied, with a faint smile. She smiled too, but her eyes dimmed slightly. "Yeah, it's just, sometimes I can't tell what's real and what's performance anymore." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "Me neither." The answer made Rachel's heart pause. And in that moment, between a warm cup of coffee and the morning sunlight pouring through high-rise windows, she realized something. This was no longer just about the contract, not entirely. Something had already begun to slip beyond the boundaries they thought would keep them safe. 3 days after the wedding, they flew to Hawaii. No press, no paparazzi, no reporters hiding behind palm trees. Just the ocean, the sky, and a rare kind of silence Rachel hadn't felt since everything began. They stayed in a small beachfront villa where the only sounds were waves and the scent of sea salt in the breeze. Ethan did everything like a proper new husband, booked the private stay, customized the meals, even tied her shoelaces before their morning walks. But it didn't feel rehearsed anymore. There was no stiffness, just a quiet, easy rhythm between them. A kind of stillness she didn't expect. Each passing day in Hawaii seemed to blur the invisible wall between them. No more guarded glances, no more scripted words or calculated smiles, just quiet mornings, shared laughter over coffee, and conversations that, though casual on the surface, began to peel back layers they hadn't intended to reveal. One afternoon, they lay on the grass behind the villa, staring at a sky streaked with sunlight. For a while, neither of them spoke. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the cliffs nearby. "What did you want to be when you were little?" Ethan asked, his voice low and a bit hoarse from the sun. Rachel turned to him, surprised. It was the first time he'd asked her something unrelated to the contract or a schedule. "I wanted to be a filmmaker," she said, smiling softly. "To tell stories. When I was a kid, I used to cover my desk lamp with scarves to make stage lights and make my mom play the princess." Ethan laughed, a real light, unguarded laugh that felt as warm as the sand beneath their hands. "So why didn't you follow it?" She paused before answering. "Because real life isn't a movie. My mom got sick, I dropped out of college, took whatever job I could to keep us going. I chose what could pay the bills, not what let me dream." He didn't say a word. He simply reached out, quietly taking her hand in his. No script, no performance. That evening, they sat on the porch together, the breeze rustling the palms, red wine glinting in their glasses. Rachel spoke about the long shifts, smiling through customers' complaints, counting tips that barely covered medicine. She didn't cry, but her eyes carried a tiredness only someone who'd lived that life could see. Ethan listened. When she finished, he simply said, "You're not a failure. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." She looked up at him, and for the first time, his eyes didn't seem distant. They were deep, vulnerable, human. Then it was Ethan's turn. He spoke of a childhood spent in a mansion too large for a boy to feel safe. Piano lessons, writing lessons, 2 languages by age 4, not out of passion, but because his grandfather believed heirs don't get to be weak. He spoke of his mother, the only one who taught him silence wasn't safety, and how she left when he was 13, leaving him behind with a father who only cared about numbers. "I used to think love was a luxury," Ethan said quietly. "Unnecessary, unreal. But then, you came along, and you're different." Rachel stayed silent. Her heart beat softly, afraid to break whatever this fragile thing was between them. And in that moment, she understood. Behind the armor of a successful man was a boy who had once been abandoned, who had taught himself that tenderness was something he'd never earn. And maybe, just maybe. That was why she was beginning to trust him. That night, they sat together on the porch, watching the ocean stretch into darkness. The breeze brushed gently across their faces. Ethan handed her a glass of red wine and looked her directly in the eye. "If things had been different, if we'd met under normal circumstances," he said quietly, "do you think we'd be like this?" Rachel said nothing. There was no clear answer. But in that moment, she realized something. She didn't care what was real or fake anymore. Not here. Not with him. They kissed on the 6th night in Hawaii. No music, no cameras, no media watching from the shadows. Just a quiet evening, sheer curtains swaying in the wind, and the way his eyes found hers when she smiled. Soft, sad, and more real than anything else had ever been. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't required. It was thank you. It was maybe. It was everything they hadn't dared to speak. Rachel didn't close her eyes. She wanted to remember every second of it, because this was the first time she kissed someone not for the role, but for the feeling. And she was sure Ethan felt the same. When they pulled away, his forehead rested gently against hers, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I don't want it to end." Rachel didn't answer. She just nodded, and for the first time since all of this began, she silently wished that time would stop. The air between them was still warm with something unspoken, something new. Neither of them moved for a long moment, as if afraid the world would resume and take it all away. Hawaii faded behind them like a tender dream. Rachel watched the ocean vanish below the clouds, holding on to the stillness she'd found. As the plane touched down in New York, she felt the city's coldness not on her skin, but deep beneath it, something sharper than wind. A warning, maybe, a whisper in her chest that something was off. Life after the honeymoon fell back into routine. Meetings, events, eyes watching their every move. But something had changed. Ethan was no longer the man she shared sunsets with in Hawaii. He was distant, quiet. Sometimes he looked at her like she was someone he didn't quite recognize. Rachel tried not to overthink. He was busy. He needed space. But the shift felt undeniable. Something between them was beginning to slip. Then, one evening, she heard a conversation from his office. The door was ajar. Lucas hired someone to look into her? Ethan's voice, low but unmistakable. "I haven't said anything yet. I need to verify the details." Rachel froze. Lucas, Ethan's ambitious cousin, who had always eyed the CEO position. Now he was investigating her? She didn't walk in. She didn't confront him then. She just turned and left. And in that moment, the cold she'd felt earlier finally had a name: betrayal. The next morning, Rachel brewed coffee as always. Ethan entered the kitchen as if nothing had changed. "You had someone follow me?" she asked, straight to the point. Ethan stopped mid-step. The air between them froze. "It wasn't me," he replied after a pause. "It was Lucas. But I did receive the report." She looked at him, eyes sharp. "And you believed what you read over what I told you?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted. "There were inconsistencies. You said you studied at Brooklyn College, but the report showed you once applied to Parsons. And the girl you called your sister, she's actually a roommate." "So you think I'm lying?" Her voice trembled. "After everything we've been through, everything we shared, you still think I'm playing some kind of game?" "I just needed to be sure," he said quietly. "I've been betrayed before. I can't let it happen again." But his words didn't soothe her. They burned. She understood his fear. But more than that, she felt the sting of his choice. He didn't trust her, not even once. From that day on, silence lived between them. No arguments, no yelling, just quiet meals, backs turned in bed, early departures, and late returns. Two strangers living under the same roof, unwilling or perhaps unable to reach across the growing space between them. Ethan buried himself in work. Rachel returned to something she had long forgotten: writing. She didn't write to publish. She wrote to breathe, to make sense of herself again. Her stories circled around a woman torn between two worlds, one built on dreams, the other crumbling with doubt. Then, one day, a message from Julia appeared. "Lucas is calling a private board meeting. Be careful." Rachel's heart sank. If Ethan lost his place, the contract could dissolve, and everything they'd built would disappear. She wanted to warn him, but she paused. Why protect someone who doesn't believe in you? The question echoed through her all night. In the days of cold silence between them, Rachel didn't cry, didn't complain. She didn't beg to be understood, nor did she try to explain herself further. But deep down, she knew if she didn't stand up for herself, no one else would do it for her. And she knew Lucas, the man who always seemed to hover just outside the frame, wasn't simply a cousin. She began her own investigation. Quietly, from archived documents in the company library to former colleagues who had worked with Lucas in the finance department, Rachel followed the trail of suspicious investments, shady acquisitions Ethan had never been informed about. She had no system access, but she had memory, intuition, and patience. One night, she entered Ethan's office while he was away. She opened his laptop and typed in the password, his mother's birthday. She remembered it from one quiet night in Hawaii. He would never have guessed she remembered. Within minutes, she found what she was looking for: documents proving that Lucas had created a fake investment fund using Ethan's name to acquire shares from small stakeholders and transferring them back to an offshore company under a hidden identity. Ethan had no idea. Neither did the board, but if she didn't act now, everything would implode within days. Rachel printed the documents. She sent copies to Julia, the only person she still trusted. And the next morning, she walked into Lucas's closed-door board meeting. Rachel walked straight into the boardroom on the 45th floor, where the air was thick with Lucas's ongoing presentation. Heads turned, confused, slightly irritated. She wasn't invited, she wasn't expected, but she didn't flinch. Holding the thick file tightly, her steps steady, her gaze locked on Lucas, the man standing confidently beside a presentation on corporate restructuring. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, voice calm but cutting, "but I believe everyone here will want to look at this before handing over any power." She set the heavy file down on the table. The slap of paper hitting wood echoed in the room like a warning bell. All eyes turned to Lucas. He stiffened, fingers tightening around the remote. A few board members opened the documents immediately. Their expressions shifted from curious to confused to stunned. Whispers rose, questions formed. The shift in the room was sudden and irreversible. Lucas was no longer the trusted candidate, but a man with his back to the wall. After the meeting, Ethan rushed into the hallway to catch her. "Rachel!" his voice cracked. She turned, her expression calm, unreadable. "I knew you wouldn't believe me if I tried to explain, so I chose to prove it." He stepped closer, eyes locked on hers, as if seeing her for the very first time. "I was wrong," he said, voice shaking. "I shouldn't have doubted you. Not after everything we shared. You listened to me, cared for me, saw me, and I couldn't even give you the decency of trust." Rachel didn't respond. Apologies can fall short, but true regret can speak for itself. "I didn't do this for your forgiveness," she said quietly. "I did it because I know exactly who I am, and no one, not even you, gets to misdefine me." Ethan lowered his head. Then slowly, he looked up again, his eyes raw with something he could no longer hide. "I love you." Rachel froze, her heartbeat stilled. Not because of the contract, not because of appearances, but because of who you are. Strong, honest, so real you made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. A breeze whispered through the glass corridor, fresh and almost tender. In the middle of a cold, corporate world, two people stood face to face, not as CEO and contractual wife, but as two souls who had crossed pain, mistrust, and found perhaps the first glimmer of faith. Rachel didn't speak, but for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Soft, warm, real. And for now, that was enough. A week after that pivotal meeting, Ethan took Rachel to a quiet park tucked in the middle of the city, the same place where they had once walked side by side in silence, when a contract still held them together like an invisible thread. But this time, there were no conditions, no suspicions, no roles to play. Just a man learning how to love again, and a woman healing enough to believe once more. They sat on a wooden bench beneath trees just beginning to turn gold with the early fall. Ethan took her hand, not tightly, but gently enough for her to feel the honesty in his touch. "I don't want to waste another day running from how I feel," he said slowly. "I was wrong to let fear dictate my heart, but today I want to say this, not because of a contract, not out of obligation, but simply because I love you." Rachel turned toward him, silent. Then Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. No fuss, no diamonds, just a simple silver ring with a clear white stone. Honest, like the love he meant to offer. "This time," he said, eyes never leaving hers, "this proposal is real, no contracts, just my heart, choosing you." She didn't speak right away, but tears fell quietly down her cheeks, and when she nodded, the world seemed to pause for just a moment, to make room for a happiness so pure it could only come after pain, after doubt, after all the moments they thought they wouldn't make it. Their second wedding had no lavish gowns or million-dollar rings, just a few close friends, a backyard by the lake, and sunlight dancing across the water like gold. Rachel wore a simple white dress, hair down. Ethan wore a navy tie, the color she once said matched his eyes best. They exchanged vows, not because anyone was watching, but because they wanted to. No fireworks, but there were steady hands, soft glances, and a kiss that was completely, absolutely real, not for anyone else, not for anything else, but love. A few months later, Rachel opened her own boutique event company, putting her storytelling, aesthetic, and heartfelt touch into every gathering she curated. She no longer had to fake her smile, because now everything she did came from joy. Ethan stepped down as CEO. He didn't abandon finance, but he carved out time to pursue something he'd once buried deep: design. He started from scratch, sketching, taking night classes, and setting up a small studio in their attic. Rachel would often drop by with coffee and unqualified but passionate feedback. They lived in an apartment that wasn't huge or glamorous, but filled with light and soft jazz in the mornings. They cooked together, argued over who should do the dishes, then laughed about it. Their love wasn't cinematic, but it was real enough to heal. Because in the end, they hadn't just chosen to stay, they had chosen to trust, something no contract could ever create.